Mm. How do I get myself up again?
Well, way to go. I really appreciate your being with us and having this chance to learn and understand our finances together is such an important part of things. So I just want to ground us first in why we are here and what we are about. It has been a joy this week to be able to really spend time with our mission and visionary goals, and I just want to bring us all a little bit into that space. Our mission of this church, one that we, for some of us, have inherited and some of us helped to create, tells us that in the universalist spirit of love and hope, we give, receive, and grow. We have been talking a lot about love lately, love as an action word, love as something we do, a way that we are together. And I have been holding on equally over the last few weeks to hope. Love and hope. What would it be if, as Arif challenged us this morning, what would it be if we could imagine a greater grace, a greater abundance than we know right now? And what if we orient ourselves toward that hope? In the universalist spirit of love and hope, we are in the continual spiritual practices, of giving and receiving and growing together. So as we begin, let's do so with lighting our chalice and joining in saying those chalice lighting words if you know them. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its love. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. And I'm grateful to turn this over to Mark, our treasurer.
Thanks, Jen. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Mark Gorlick. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a brown-haired, blue-eyed, clean-shaven, solidly but gently middle-aged white male. And I am delighted to be a member of the Board of Trustees here at First Universalist and serve as the treasurer this year. And we're here today for an initial presentation of our budget, where we are in the budget process. So what I'd like to do is to start by walking through, reminding you of the budgeting process, so everybody knows who's responsible for what and how this goes. Talk about our current budget projection based on where we're at in the pledging cycle. And then we'll have time for any questions or feedback from you all, either in person or online. I assume somebody's monitoring the chats, great. And then we'll talk about next steps, okay? So I guess I'd first start by saying that I don't think of a budget as a set of numbers. A budget is a set of choices. And a budget is really just a reflection of how we balance across three sets of considerations. The first is what we're aiming to accomplish, right? Our mission, our visionary goals. The second is how we hope to accomplish that, our organizational norms and practices that in turn are steeped in our values. And then the third is the resources that we have available to do that. And when we balance across those three things, that creates what we call a budget. So the process for doing that, this is according to our bylaws and our policy handbook, we start with the minister and the board jointly agreeing on a set of guiding principles that will help us put together to guide those choices that we have to make. An example is, are we aiming for a budget that is in balance? Are we aiming to generate a bit of a surplus, or are we willing to engage in some deficit spending? That's a guiding principle that would help in making those choices. And then once we've established those guiding principles together, then the minister is charged with putting together a budget that balances across those three things following those guiding principles. We then work with the board, works with the minister to ensure that we have a budget that in fact is following those guiding principles, that we are comfortable with that balance. On behalf of the board, the finance committee dives into detail and looks at, asks about some of the assumptions and, in some cases checks the math and things like that. But ultimately then the board and the minister collaboratively agree on a budget that we will bring to the congregation with input from the congregation. So this is part of that input process, because the board's job is to ascertain the input from the congregation on that process. And then ultimately the congregation is the one that decides on the budget. We present it at the annual meeting and hopefully approve it. So in terms of the timeline, we start really in January with just a high-level budget goal. And that's what informs the pledge drive. So we do that in January, February. We then talk about that during the pledge. Here's where we hope to be for next year's budget at an overall level, not with details of the spending, but at an overall level. Here's what we hope to have in terms of pledged commitments. And then over the next couple of months, as we see where we are in the pledge, then the minister works to take where we actually are and put that into a budget that is reviewed by the finance committee and the board in April. So we've just completed that. And so we then have a meeting today to share where we are. So I'll talk through that in just a minute. Ultimately, between now and our next board meeting in the middle of May, we will work to see if any additional pledges come in, incorporate the input that we get from the congregation so that we come up with a final budget in time for our annual meeting, which will be in early June. So that's the process. So let's talk about where we are. Let's build the budget. So if we can go to the next slide, Olu. All right, so we have basically 4 categories of revenue and 4 categories of expense. And let me talk through each of these. As I've mentioned previously, the vast majority of the revenue we have to work with comes from some form of congregational giving. It's about 94% of what we have to work with comes from us. So we have, the biggest chunk of that is pledged income. So each year we ask people to make a commitment to make a donation to the church for the following year. That's the pledge. It's by far the most certain income, because if I promise to give a certain amount of money to the church, I will likely give that money to the church. So that's the biggest line item, is in the top. We also have other forms of fundraising. That includes the Sunday offering. That includes any special fundraising appeals, like we have a fundraiser for the Boston Youth Trip. That line also includes proceeds from our endowment. So that's not current congregational giving, that's past congregational giving. But that's all wrapped up in the fundraising line. We have a line there for capital reserve. That's another form of fundraising. So some years that's very big, if we're having a capital campaign. Other years it's smaller, but we ask people to make donations toward capital improvements or to loan payments. And then the last category is earned revenue. That's the smallest category, but that's the money we get, for example, from renting rooms, from leasing something on the roof for a cell phone antenna. So that's not congregational giving, but those are our 4 categories of revenue. So pledged income, fundraising, capital fundraising, and earned revenue. On the expense side, we have 4 categories of expense. The largest of those is salaries and benefits. So that's the money that goes to pay our staff, pay for things like their health insurance, retirement, and other benefits. So that's direct payments to our staff, is that first line. Second line is administrative expenses. That is the category of things that funds the overall operations of the church, but not attributable to any particular program. It includes things like our software licenses. It includes things like bank fees and a variety of other things. The biggest line item in that administrative is our dues to the Unitarian Universalist Association. So about 40% of administrative costs, usually, oh, administrative costs, that, you know, how do we cut that? 40% of our administrative cost is the dues we pay to the UUA. And I will note that the UUA has a formula for calculating what a congregation's dues should be based on its membership. They're to some extent voluntary. We don't get kicked out of the UUA if we don't pay our fair share. At least in the time I've been at the church, we have not paid our fair share. And frankly, the other church I belong to in Milwaukee, we never paid our fair share. And it always really bothered me, frankly, because I feel like we get a lot out of the UUA. So, but that's a big chunk of our administrative expense. Third category is program expense. This is expenses that can be directly attributed to one or more of our programs. Biggest items in here, childcare for Sunday morning and for events, RE curricula and supplies, the accompanists are included in here, and some other things. So that's program expense. And then the last is buildings and grounds. And if you actually look at the detailed budget, there's 2 components of this. This is maintenance. This is capital improvements. This is our utilities. And it also includes our construction loan repayment. So those are bundled into buildings and grounds. So those are the categories, and I will walk through how we've put together each of those. If you can go to the next slide, Olu. So as Jen mentioned this morning, we've created 3 budgets, okay, based on where our pledge income ultimately ends up. The middle one is the one that we realistically can hope to achieve. The high one is our aspirational. Boy, this would be awesome if we could do this, because it would really allow us to do more towards our visionary goals. And then the low end is obviously a worst case scenario. Those 3 income lines are pretty consistent across all of them. Fundraising, capital reserve, earned revenue. Those are, we're assuming those are pretty much the same. And one thing I will point out is that I should actually, before this, talk about the principles that we laid out, because I said that's what we start with. What are the principles guiding this? So there are a few things that we decided. The first is that we would submit a balanced budget. The last few years, because of all the disruptions from the pandemic and the immediate post-pandemic, we had to engage in some deficit spending. That's okay, you can do that for a while, that's why we have reserves, but we're at the point where our reserves are sufficiently depleted that we need to have a balanced budget. So one of the principles was the budget would be balanced. Second principle is that we were going to decrease our reliance on some of these lines, in particular the fundraising line. And we were going to try to make it more in line with what our past performance has been and what we actually have planned for fundraising. The last couple of years, that has fallen short. And I talked about that at the mid-year meeting, that we had fallen short on both our pledged income not being what people had said they would give and our fundraising falling short. We've heard from you how stressful it is, and believe me, it's stressful for me too, to constantly come back and say, oh my gosh, we're in trouble, we're not hitting our goal, we need more. And so we wanted to make more conservative assumptions about what we would be doing there. So that was a second principle. The third principle is we still have some staff who are not paid at the minimum guidelines according to the UUA. We don't think that's right. We think we should at least be paying the minimum UUA, and so one of our principles was to ask Jen to bring all staff salaries up to at least the minimum. The third was we haven't had a real cost of living increase in a while, and I think we are all well aware of the fact that the cost of living has actually gone up, so we wanted to build in at least a modest cost of living increase for everybody on the staff, and 3% was the minimum we were trying to aim for. We wanted to increase our UUA contribution to get closer to our fair share, which I talked about before. And then in the event that we needed to make any staff reductions, because if our revenue falls short of what we need it to be, salaries and benefits are the biggest line item. Almost certainly the only way to get to a balanced budget would have to come from that line. That if we did that those would be whole positions rather than pieces of people's positions. And there are two reasons for that. One is you almost never get to where you need to by little pieces of people's positions. So I'll cut you from a 0.9 to a 0.8. It just doesn't add up very quickly. More importantly, I think that usually ends up with people doing the same amount of work but getting paid less, and we just did not feel that that was fair and equitable. So the direction to Jen was, if you have to make a reduction, it should be a person and not just ask everybody else to just pitch in and do more stuff. And then we also had an initial aspiration guiding us to, we've had to make some cuts in recent years, particularly from administrative and custodial lines, to try to restore those if we could. So those were the guiding principles that we laid out when Jen started assembling this. So again, that fundraising line reflects one of those principles, was to try to be more realistic about what would come from there. Okay, so that's so each of those is consistent across the three. Olu, could you go to the next slide? So what's different across the three is the amount of pledge income that we expect to get, okay? You will recall that when we first started, when you got your pledge packets, we said, we are aiming for a budget goal of $1.8 million next year, and we are aiming to get pledge income of $1.6 million. Some of you have asked, how come these numbers are moving around? So that's what I want to explain. The 1.8 million came from this high-end scenario of, if we could follow all of those principles, if we could accomplish all of that stuff, that's what it would take to do it. So that's what we'd like to do. That's our aspiration. And in order to try to minimize our reliance on some of these less certain forms of revenue, like the fundraising, we were trying to maximize the pledge income that would support that budget. As Jen pointed out, we're currently at just a little over $1 million, so the high-end scenario does reflect a little bit of an increase in fundraising from what, we were hoping not to have to do any initially. I think the number we have here we think is realistic, given that there is a Sunday offering and given that we do have endowment income. But that's the difference between the 1.6 that you initially saw in your pledge, like, God, if we could get everything we wanted for this, to the 1.4 you see on the high-end scenario there, okay? But the difference in the scenarios is how much pledge income we think we can get. 1.1 at the low end, 1.3 in the middle, and 1.4 at the top. And if you go to the next slide, Olu. So these are the total revenue that we would have to work with for the year. If you're adding these numbers up in your head, they won't add up. And the reason for that is we know that not all the pledges get fulfilled. People's circumstances changed. I pledged to give X, but I can't do it anymore. People leave the church for some reason. So we build in a shrinkage factor. So what I'm showing here is we hope that people will commit pledges of 1.4 million, but we know that the actual number will be a little bit smaller than that. And so the totals here reflect that. So I'm focusing on the midpoint here. Our midpoint, which frankly would be a stretch from here, but I think is a realistic stretch from here, from where we are in terms of pledged income so far, represents a 4.7% increase in revenue from what we budgeted for this current year. So not a huge increase. So this year's total revenue that was budgeted was $1.61 million. We're aiming for 1.695 next year. So it's a slight increase in total revenue to the church. That make sense? You can see the breakdown. So pledge income is 76% of what we have to work with. Fundraising is 11%. The capital reserve is 8%, and 6% comes from that earned revenue. So those are the three scenarios we built on the revenue side. I want to talk about the expenses that we're proposing, and I'm going to focus on the middle column because, again, that's the mid-range that we think is realistic, a realistic stretch. And then I'll, for comparison, show you the others. So if you can go to the next. Buildings and grounds, $255,000. That is 16% of our total spend. That is a 3% increase from this year. That reflects what we anticipate will be increased utility costs, the maintenance costs, et cetera. And that's going to be consistent across all three scenarios. Next line. Program expense. This year was quite a bit higher than that. It was about $100,000. Next year, we have program expenses of $83,000, which is an 18% reduction from this year. So again, that's coming from things like childcare, programming for our community suppers, RE curricula and supplies, et cetera. And it's about 5% of our total spend. Next. The administrative costs, that mid-range projection is about $140,000. 8% of our total. It's a 9% reduction from this year. So we're trying to reduce those expenses as much as possible. And again, keep in mind that 40% of our administrative costs are due to the UUA. So this is not, I mean, it does include things like printing and paper, but it also includes things like bank fees that we have no choices about. And then if you could show the next one. So salaries and benefits, $1.2 million approximately. Again, 71% of all our expense goes to people. And that represents essentially flat from this year, about a 1% increase compared to this year. If you can go one more, Olu. So total expense of $1.7 million, which is essentially flat from this year's total expense. Remember, the revenue is an increase from last year, but last year we were budgeting a deficit. This year, even if we have a 5% increase in our revenue, our expenses will have to stay flat because we've committed to a balanced budget. Okay? Make sense? Okay. If you could show the next, just to show you the variation between these scenarios, okay? And I transposed that salaries and benefits when I made the slide, so that 1.01 should be in the low column, and the 1.27 should be in the high column, okay? Apologize for that. Administrative expenses are essentially the same across all of them, and then the program expenses, there's some variability across those scenarios as well. If we have to go to the low scenario, oh, sorry, again, I transposed a couple of those. I was doing these this morning, so I apologize. If we have to go with the low scenario, that will be a further reduction in program and a further reduction in salaries and benefits, but the administrative is consistently cut across all of them. Okay, so you can go to the next slide, please. So I just want to talk about some of the key implications of this before we open it up for comments and questions. And Jen talked about this morning. Both the mid-range and the low-end estimate budgets will require personnel cuts. And I got to tell you, I've been working with Jen on this for weeks. I've dived into this. I have most of this memorized at this point. And when Jen talked about it at the pulpit this morning, it hit me in the gut. There's just no good way to think about that. It is painful. It is painful not only because it represents, an impact on our programming, but it affects people that we care deeply about. So I'm just going to say I don't love talking about this. And I know Jen doesn't love talking about this. But that is the reality. So both of those scenarios, there's no way to get to a balanced budget in either of those scenarios with that amount of pledged income without some staff cuts. So that's one. In the mid-range, as Jen mentioned earlier, it's the elimination of one full-time position. In the low end, it would be 2 full-time positions. There's some other implications. At the mid-range, we can give a cost of living increase, but not all of our staff would get up to those UUA minimums yet. We'd have a minimal increase to our giving to the UUA, our dues, and we could restore a little bit of the staffing that we've lost, but still have some gaps and some of the staffing cuts that we've had from previous years. At the low end, it's 2 full-time positions. We would continue our facilities as is, so no restoration there. We would not be able to provide cost of living increases to the other staff. We would not be able to increase our UUA giving. This is a very bare bones budget. If you can go to the next slide, though, I wanted to finish the implications on the high end. This was the aspiration that we first shared with you when we said at the beginning of the pledge drive, we would aim for a budget of $1.8 million last year. The reason we did is because that's what this would allow us to do. We could retain all of our leadership positions. We could restore the cuts that we've had to make to facility staffing and be able to increase some administrative support that we've cut previously, which has a huge impact on the day-to-day work of our other staff. We'd be able to bring everybody up to minimum UUA guidelines, give everybody a cost of living increase, and we would be able to make a further steps towards paying our fair share to the UUA. So if we could get to this, that's what we could do. So if you could go to the next slide. I think before I open it up for questions and comments, I just wanted to say a couple of things. First is, again, I don't think anybody loves the idea of either of those two mid-range or low scenarios. Question I've been asked, so who makes those decisions? Who decides that? As I said, the board and the senior minister work collaboratively to decide what our guidelines are, and then it is up to the senior minister to decide how to apply those guidelines to the budget. So ultimately deciding what is the best combination of reductions that we can make that will allow us to fulfill the visionary goals and be consistent with the guidelines that the board laid out. And then ultimately the board has to ratify and approve those. So it is initially the minister's decisions and then reviewed and ratified by the board. And then we have to feel comfortable that with something that we can then bring to the congregation for approval. So that's the process. And the other thing is we're not alone in this, right? A lot of churches are facing this. Expenses are going up and giving is flat. That's just a reality that many churches are facing. So that doesn't make it great. I don't know if misery really loves company because it's still miserable, but this isn't just the First Universalist is struggling. All of our UU churches, and frankly a lot of other churches, are facing the same kinds of things. The last thing I wanted to mention, because a few people have asked about it, so I might get a question, so I'll head off the question since you've already asked me the question. How do we compare with other UU churches in this? So I was able to get some comparative data from the UUA. Again, we get stuff from the UUA. I'm glad we pay at least some of our dues. So they do share data. There are a couple of caveats. Their data are for 2022 to 23, and I was comparing to our 23-24 budget. So it's a year old, but it's probably close enough. The bigger caveat is the UUA reports in ranges of church size. There's 4 categories they have. Their largest category is churches with 400 to 800 members. And there's about 41 congregations in that category. Our last member count was 993. So we're actually above that range. But there's so few churches that are bigger than 800 members, they don't want to report those separately because they're worried about confidentiality stuff. So just keep that in mind. We're actually outside the top end of the range. But that said, I was able to get data on FTEs and total budget. So when I look at FTEs, what they say is that largest category typically have 5 to 10 FTEs on staff. And when you consider that it's a twofold range in size from 400 to 800, it makes sense that there's a twofold range in FTEs. That count includes ministers. It does not include some other positions. It doesn't include things like bookkeeping, custodial staff, and a couple of other things that many smaller churches would not hire somebody, they would contract it. So they're trying to make sure you can make apples to apples comparisons. So again, 5 to 10 is the typical for those large churches. We have 12.5 FTE. And when I back out the ones that are excluded, so it's a direct comparison, we have 10. So we're at the upper end of the range, 5 to 10 FTEs. We have 10, but again, we're a bit above the size range for the largest churches. On the total budget size, the median for those large churches, again, between 400 and 800 members, was $900,000 a year and a half ago. And the 95th percentile was $1.7 million. Our budget last year was essentially $1.7 million of expense. So again, we're at about the 95th percentile of those large churches, although we are above the 95th percentile for size. So again, these are not perfect comparisons. It's the best I could do with the data that's available, but I would say that we're pretty much in range for both staffing and total budget for a church of our size, which is almost 1,000 members. So I know a few of you have asked that before, and I just wanted to make sure to provide that. So with that, I would ask what questions people have or what input people have on what you've heard. And do we have a microphone to carry around? Great. Thank you.
First, I just want to comment that you're doing a great job of explaining this.
Oh, thank you.
It's one of the better.
Thank you.
So my question relates to scenario, the mid-range.
Yeah.
And
Whoops. We've got people on Zoom. I want to make sure they can hear you as well. There we go. Thanks.
Okay, about the mid-range projection. In the salary area, it looks like there was a priority of giving remaining staff the cost of living increase over retaining all the staff. That if you didn't lose one staff member,
Right.
and you kept all staff, but you didn't do the increase, we could have been in the same place. Why were those two things prioritized that way?
Jen, you want to speak to that?
Really good question. I know, looking at it with you this morning, I was like, oh, it looks like we're spending the same amount on staffing and benefits in mid-range when we're losing a position. That is correct. And part of that is because, as Mark said, the cost of running an organization goes up year over year, even if you keep things exactly the same. So the cost of health insurance goes up year over year. The cost of the other benefits that are provided to staff goes up year over year. So I have to take that into account in that overall staffing, salary, and compensation budget. And so that's part of what you're seeing, is that the cost of having the same number of staff, even if there are no salary increases, goes up every single year. So that's a big chunk right there. And then the other piece was, in the mid-range, part of what I'm trying to do is help us move forward in some way in the direction of our values. Even if we do need to make a staffing reduction, how can we get closer to fair compensation for our staff, and how can we restore at least a little bit of our facilities hours? Because part of what happened last year was that we reduced both of those facilities positions, and we reduced one of them so far that it no longer qualifies for health insurance. That doesn't feel good in terms of lining up with our values and what's actually needed. So part of what I did in this budget was partially restore those facilities hours so that at least I could get those positions up to benefits eligible.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jen. And the last thing I'd say is the difference between those two lines is relatively small, but it's about $60,000, which is not insubstantial, in the big picture. Because we really were committed to coming out with a zero deficit. So even that small difference makes a difference. But I do think, we really did, and again, these were guiding principles that we came up with. We thought being fair and equitable to our people was really important. And it's important from an ethical perspective. It's also, frankly, practically important. If people go year after year without getting an increase, if somebody goes another year without being benefits eligible, they're going to look for another job someplace else. And that doesn't help us either. But thank you for the question. Really appreciate it. Okay.
This is from Christina Nicholson. Where are we year for year with percentage of members who have pledged? Is there a specific strategy for reaching out to existing members who have still not pledged?
Great question. Does somebody more involved in stewardship want to tackle that one. I could give a high-level picture, but
I can say that if you would like to participate in solving our struggles, after this budget meeting, immediately, we are having a call party. I forgot the party hats this week, but we'll have them for next week. No, I'm not kidding. We have lists of 5 people for folks to call. You can take more. Arif and I will speed train you to make these calls. We have sample scripts. We have voicemail text. We have text. We have so many ways. And we can plug you into our larger systems of closing that gap from a stewardship perspective. But Mark, if you could answer the other one, that would be great.
yeah, I don't remember off the top of my head the percentage. It's not off by a ton. What I will say is we have a large number of folks who have recurring donations, which is fantastic because that way you don't have to think about it, it just happens. The problem is that you don't have to think about it. And so for a lot of those folks, we haven't heard from them one way or another, whether they're continuing their commitment, but also whether they might consider increasing it, because it's on autopilot, you don't have to think about whether or not you're willing to give more. So we are reaching out specifically to people who have recurring donations. The other thing is a couple of folks have mentioned that they had made pledges, but they hadn't been acknowledged yet. Unfortunate timing, but in January, late January this year, we had a database conversion. And again, because of limited resources, we had to do that database conversion with fewer resources than we did the last time we did a data conversion. Took longer, and so we're behind on getting those things in. So we do know what the pledges are, but we haven't yet acknowledged them to people because of that gap. So for those of you who made a pledge and you're wondering, how come you didn't let me know you got it and thank me, I apologize. We have gotten them. I do thank you, and we're working on catching up on that backlog. So it's not an issue of, are there pledges out there we don't know about? But we don't know about recurring pledges, and there are still some people that we haven't heard from. There's always a tail every year, and we have strategies for trying to reach out to them, including the call party that Ashley mentioned.
I'm Jenny McIninch, and I have a question for into the future as well. I'm retired, and I have a chunk of money that I have designated for charitable distributions. I rolled over the IRA, and I won't have to pay the taxes on these because I'm giving them to church and good places. I don't know if it makes sense to practically deplete that amount in the next couple years for church, because somehow we're going to get ourselves out of this, that we're not going to have to be asking people to give beyond and beyond and beyond. So is there a strategy for bringing in more people, convincing people that generosity needs to get more generous? That's my question.
Yeah. It's a great question. I saw some nods. What I would say is in the short term, I don't have that answer. We did, as we talked about previously, we did reconstitute a stewardship team, and part of what they're really focusing on is that long-term fundraising approach, including questions like that. They haven't figured that out yet, but they're working on that. I will say that we've talked about trying to get some people to make multi-year commitments. So my wife Lynn and I met with Arif, and we did that. We made a multi-year commitment, which included a substantial increase this year, and recognizing that we would be moving towards retirement in the next few years, a plan for that to switch from operations to capital and then ultimately ratchet down. But that gives us something to plan on, because these annual cycles, of course, are a little bit challenging. And so that's another thing that the stewardship team is looking at, is approaching people to make multi-year commitments so that we can plan and they can plan, frankly.
Ginny, I just want to say that Arif and I have been working on a lot of strategies around the longer arc here. When I started at my past church, our giving levels were dramatically lower than what they were when I left. And it wasn't because of me, it was because of the culture shift that happened with people talking to each other about giving and building their own ethic around giving that was powerful and self-motivating. And I just want to say that when I look at our numbers here and now, the majority of our giving is under capacity. there is significant capacity that we have not yet reached because we haven't built the collective ethos and we haven't built the mass scale level of conversations and relationships and asking each other for resources that is possible. And my understanding is that we need an on-ramp to do that culture shift. Without the on-ramp, we're just gonna lose capacity to shift the culture that we need to shift in order to build the future that we want to build. So from my perspective, and I am not a financial advisor, these are critical years for investment. These are the years where we figure out what our future looks like together. These are the years where we shift culture. These are the years where we mentor younger givers, where we mentor folks into a relationship with church that transforms them and the church at the same time. And we can't do that without an on-ramp. And I'm out of breath because I care about this a lot. Thank you for asking, Jenny.
I want you to see you with your hands up. I'm just making my way around in order.
Hi, Dylan Vinakta. I was wondering if we have any insight into how active the membership is. I know we have 900 and something members,
Right.
but being an usher and regularly counting people and things like that, at least in the one service, it doesn't, like come up to that level on a weekly basis, obviously. And so, also, is there any information from the UUA on like general membership engagement? I know that the question was already asked about like percentage with pledge.
Right. To answer the last part, I've not seen anything from the UUA that I would tap into. It's not that it's not there, I just haven't looked for it. This is going to test my memory skills of how thoroughly I studied the minister's report in our board packet, but I believe our average attendance, Sunday attendance, when you include both services and online for both services, is hovering around 380, 400, something like that.
It is, and part of what I've noticed, because I look at that pretty regularly, is that our attendance numbers over the last couple months are meeting where we were in 2019 at this point, which is really unusual for a congregation in a positive way. So I'm taking note and I'm watching as we are feeling that renewed sense of engagement. Dylan, the other thing that I get to see all week long is the variety of ways that people engage at church, and it really is amazing. So community dinner, regularly 100 to 125 people here. Daytime Connections, which is programmed largely for folks who are in the older half of life, packed on Thursdays. So people are engaging in a variety of different ways, and this is common, especially in a larger congregation, for folks to find different pockets that really are what matter the most to them and to plug in there. So it'd be rare to see everybody all at once. When we do, it's amazing.
Yeah.
Piali, Amelia Marquez with a dead mic. Looking at this as somebody that has been on the end of both bargaining and all the other craziness as being a teacher right now in Minneapolis Public Schools, I do have some questions, mostly in the interest of our FTE of the church. First off, I'm just curious, what are the restorations that were mentioned in your slides?
The restorations?
Yeah.
So I think we have it there. We had one position was cut to 20 hours last year. And in the high-end scenario, that goes up to 32. Am I remembering right? Yep. So, and it goes from being not benefit eligible to being benefit eligible.
Yeah, so we're working on the mic, but for our facility staffing, it would bring them from where they are right now, it's one person at 32 hours a day and one at 20, to one at 40 and one at 30, which makes them both fully eligible for health insurance.
Right.
I know you have another question.
Oh, you are always.
For people who are online, we are waiting to have the batteries in the microphone changed so that you all can fully participate in this conversation. You could ask the question and I could repeat it if you want to do that.
Who are in these meetings other than our senior minister to represent the FTE that would be cut?
So the question was, who are in the meetings with the senior minister about those FTE cuts. Jen, that. Yeah. I'll share.
So the conversations that I have include with our leadership team on the staff, which includes Arif and Ashley and Allison and myself. So we talk together about what is most needed to continue living into the mission and vision of the church. And then I bring those conversations as well to the board executive team. We meet monthly, so they're part of that conversation as well. And I have been bringing these conversations directly to the people who might be involved as well over the last couple of weeks.
Beautiful. Hey, a working mic. That answers my next question, and I have one more and just a comment. I know last year being in this room and sitting here in a similar predicament, a big question was just asked of like regular actual fundraisers. And so I'm curious, why haven't we done year-round more impactful fundraisers like many other churches in the area do that bring in both new people but also create an environment where people are just expecting to give year-round instead of during one season?
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question, and it's one that the stewardship team is looking at. Yeah, I was just going to say, and we have a member of our stewardship team here who might be willing to speak to that. That's your cue, Janet.
One of the things is the stewardship team, of course, is working on the pledge drive, but also thinking about fundraising. And we had thought maybe this spring we'd do a fundraiser, and we put some feelers out, and we could not find anybody who was willing to do that. So we put it off toward, and we're going to be talking this week about fundraisers for next year. Possibly maybe a big one in the spring, but maybe some smaller ones, not, if you've been here a long time, you remember some of those big gala events, but they were, the people who really put those on are no longer here. They were almost professional, and they brought in loads of money. We looked at the congregation, and we just didn't think that it was going to be welcome to put in an event that was, and nobody really wanted to spend that much time to do that. But we are looking, and so if you have ideas for fundraisers, please let us know. And we have had some people talk about that.
And is it fair to say that the stewardship team would welcome additional members if anybody's interested in participating?
Okay. Yes, because actually, I'm getting too old to do this stuff forever. I would like some new members. We absolutely do need some new members, and especially for ideas. Would you like to be on the?
That's funny that you asked that, because I did actually write down next to the fundraisers in parentheses, and no, this is not signing up to delete that. I know how it goes around here as a young person. Just a final comment that I had is just as a union member and standing in solidarity with the workers of this church, I do oppose any cuts of FTE, and I would say the 3% wage increase is not enough with the way inflation has hit since COVID and the irreplaceable work of our church staff that has done for us and our community. I do urge the board to reconsider to ask for any major unneeded projects at this time and any increases in donating to UUA and to put our church workers first at this time.
Thank you.
Check, check.
Check, check. Okay.
There we go.
First, a comment for these two people that we've just heard. The Catholic Church in South Minneapolis has a fundraising event that helps them build the generation or the giving feeling in people. And afterward, I'll talk to you about that because I've been on their committee. I also served in Ann Arbor, Michigan on the UCC church, and I was asked to look at their predicament similar to ours. And one of the things that they did is timely, but will go away fairly shortly. And that is that that with COVID interrupting, many people who were having IRAs forgot to change them to Roth. And when years ago, when we wanted to add a new church building, that was totally missed, and that cost us the new building. But an IRA, when you retire, starts to whittle down as far as the taxes by the government and the state. But you get credit for any of those to donate to a church or and that's what we do. So for us, what we did was years ago make sure children asked for the maximum amount of Roth each year from their income when they were in income years. Now they're both in a situation where they don't have their Roths are doing quite well, because if it's a managed Roth, it increases and it never decreases. Now, I would like to see us take advantage of the COVID situation, because a lot of us couldn't contribute to at the time from our Roth, diminishing our Roth, because we were doing things mostly Roth. So one, make sure your children build Roth from the start, because it's free. You get so much per year from your annual giving, free to be Roth. And two, with our situation, there should be a fair number of people who had to avoid giving it all to maintain their Roth level 10 years ago. And if they have IRAs, they can contribute that have lost or gained, but they set up a situation where they don't owe taxes to the government or the state. And they have a retirement fund built in that can't be touched. So if there are some still remaining people, and I'm one of them, my wife has an IRA that I will have to keep diminishing, and I can contribute it as a lump sum, and that's what I did 25 years ago when I donated $25,000 to the church when they wanted to build. You can do. There are more people around in our congregation that have Roth.
Yeah, it's great to. So again, lots of great ideas about things that we can bring to the stewardship team, ways to diversify the types of giving that we have here in the church. I think that's an excellent suggestion, and there's probably others, and again, we'll bring that back to them. Well, we're waiting for the next question. Well, if you could go back, I think it's 3 slides. One more. There we go. And again, I'm sorry for the transposition, but if you focus on the salaries and benefits line, so 1 million on the low end, almost 1.3 million on the high end. If we only have $1.1 million of pledge income, if we're in the low end scenario, and we want to have the high end salary and benefit spending to make the restorations and the increases that we just talked about, then we have to find $300,000 elsewhere. Buildings and grounds is pretty much fixed. We can't do anything about our utility bills. We can't do anything about our loan payments. If you add up administrative and program together, they're not quite $300,000. So even if we eliminated all spending, and of course some of that we can't, the administrative costs, some of those we have no choice of, is a way of just saying that, whatever income we have to do the best we can with that. And I think we all agree that our people are so important, and we need to acknowledge that. We also have to recognize that to make those numbers add up, there's not that much in administrative and program that we can do away with. This is, like most churches, the vast majority of our spending is on people. The vast majority of our giving comes from us. And so again, our aspiration is to get to that level. For us to meet that aspiration, we have to make the commitment to make those resources available. I think there was a...
So I have two things. My name is Angie Donne. And the first thing is that as a relatively new member in the church, I had a recurring donation and I didn't know about the pledge. Like, I didn't understand how that worked. So I could see that that's just a communication thing to make
Good.
sure that relatively new members understand how it works in the system. And then number two, in line with what Ashley said in a race message today, is there like a mindful consumption group where we can, talk about, I'm not going to have my Starbucks today and I'm going to donate that to the church instead. Or I'm not going to buy a new shirt instead. I'm going to buy used and donate the difference to the church.
That's a great suggestion. I mean, I don't know of one, but I see Ashley writing something down, so thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Okay. Hi, I'm Gary Hooper, and I'm fairly new to the church and excited to be here. I did want to comment related to, I just want to say, if we have to cut staff, we're going to have more problems with the microphones. So we should keep that in mind. Related to the sermon today, I want you to know, like, the winter of, it was like 2014, 15, right in there, I was living illegally in studio space at 34th in Chicago. And for my shower, I'd take a bucket of hot water out onto a fire escape and hot water, lather up, and then rinse real quick with hot water and run back in. And it was invigorating. I loved it. And what I'm saying is, we are so used to the standard American dream, and it's like we lock in to the rails and ride our life in terms of how we think of ourselves and the economy and stuff, and even personal comfort. And I'm thinking if we got several households together to live within a block or two of the church, we could sell a couple of cars at least and donate the money to the church, donate the money we would be paying for car insurance on those cars to the church. We could garden together, we could take care of each other and each other's dogs and whatever. But it's like, I wonder if we could get these conversations going about revisioning our lives. And I will say this too. My daughter was here today. I was so happy. She's like 33, a young black woman. And I was just happy that she showed up. I asked her to. But one of the climate scientists who I really respect, Kevin Anderson, said, there are no non-radical futures. We need to get ready for that. We're in for a time of disruption and discontinuity. And it's going to be one thing after another. And we need to really be beloved community. So let's start this conversation going and get as deep as we can with it. So that's really what I wanted to say. But don't forget, you can actually take a shower with a bucket of hot water on a fire escape in the winter. It's invigorating. Okay, thanks.
Thank you for that, Gary.
Can I see what questions are still remaining? 1, 2, 3. Okay, I'll be right back.
Hi, I've got a couple thoughts, partially because I ran the pledge drive back before Justin came, when Frank left. And one of the things I've noticed over the years is that our giving has been very flat. It's been about $1,200. It was $1,200 that year in the midst of the recession after 2008, and it hasn't gone up a lot. We have had big drives we raised a ton of money to put money into this church, but I worry, I agree that there is capacity here. I totally agree with that, having been on that committee, but I do feel we need a balanced budget. So I have a couple thoughts. One, once upon a time we charged for RE and we decided we wouldn't. I understand those reasons. We could consider doing that again, especially for people who aren't volunteering their time to run it. Second, I have wondered, I know the UUA puts out guidelines for salaries, but it seems like those are nationwide, and I don't know how much those are driven by East Coast salaries. I'm not talking about the maintenance workers.
Yeah.
They're not getting overpaid. I mean, I think, have we looked at how those salaries line up in Minneapolis with nonprofits?
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually have, because they do break it down by region. It is not national data. So the UA salary guidelines are region specific. So.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
And, I don't know if there could be if some staff positions could be converted into more administrative positions that would help your ministerial staff do their jobs. Because what's happening now is the ministers are doing administration, right? Right. So those are just my thoughts.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay. Hi, I'm Dallas Rising, Chide. And I guess I appreciate, Angie, your question about the pledging versus automatic giving. And I have a question about that too. I'm not new anymore, but I came in at the pandemic and maybe some stuff got missed. So I'm curious about pledging. I'm an entrepreneur and don't have a steady work. I'm also a tither, so I give a percentage of my income. And so I get real nervous about the concept of pledging something when I don't know what I'm going to be able to generate. For people thinking about it, tithing was a big conversation that I had with Reverend Justin before I joined. My model of church is my sister, and she's LDS or Mormon. They tithe 10% of what they make, all of them. They're very rich church, very, very rich and powerful in a lot of ways. I think a lot about what could be possible if we did, there's no way anybody's going to mandate to Unitarian Universalists to do anything at all. But I'm just saying, it's a way of, it was a way for me to not have to have these kinds of thoughts. I can think about going above and beyond or whatever, but I am curious about the notion of pledging, because I am a person who has not pledged because I don't know what my income is going to look like, but I do know how much of my income I will be giving. And I'm wondering if that's an oversight, that it would be helpful for people, maybe in my position, to communicate that so that it just doesn't seem like we're totally checked out or like we don't care, because we do.
Yeah.
And then the other question I have is around whether that maybe Reverend Ashley talking about the culture of giving and and community culture and all that. I have a lot of skills, and I also am an entrepreneur. I could be offering my services to church members, and we could be keeping more money in the community to come back to this community. I would really love to see if that's a possibility and if there's ways that we could create those networks, because I spend a lot of time and energy worrying about things that feel like they come back to here. When we could maybe be helping each other out in that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you can talk about that pledging piece and what it means.
Absolutely.
Maybe some more of us would love to know.
Yeah, no, well, thank you for those questions. And again, for the ideas, so many great ideas are bubbling up for other ways we can think about stewardship that I think certainly the folks in here who are on the stewardship team, I know they're listening very attentively. Specifically to the pledging question, yes, some people, it's going to be hard to pledge because their income is going to be uncertain. Totally makes sense. And that's why we don't rely exclusively on that. That's sort of built into that other fundraising. So for example, people do say, oh, I got this money and I'd like to give 10%, so I'm going to give that now. I couldn't pledge it, but I'm going to give it. So we see a lot of that in that other fundraising line, because again, that includes our Sunday offering, which is where that may show up. includes in special donations and some other things. So, so we do recognize that we have to have a certain amount of that because of people's individual circumstances. That's why we don't want to rely exclusively on pledged income, but we also know that because it's uncertain, the more pledges we can get, the easier it is for us to plan for the year ahead.
All right, just jumping in to say we are past our allotted time that we said we would gather. I've got one more question. And then Mark and I and members, I'm sure, Janet from Stewardship or Matt from the board and Ilo, anybody, please come chat with us after if you have more questions.
Thanks. I'm Charles. Right there.
There you go.
I'm Charles. I want to express gratitude to the board and to Reverend Jen and to the ministers. This is a hard topic. And I also really appreciate the transparency from the pulpit the last few weeks to talk about it, to let people know this horizon is here. I think there are a few little things that could be done to help. You know, the deficit is $300,000. We're about 1,000 members. Making that a little more explicit, like on average, that's a $300 increase per member. And then in terms of the pledges, it might be helpful to be able to take them or to increase them right here after the service. I mean, even today I'm thinking, oh, I should increase my pledge, but I don't know how to do that. So having that instruction or having that capability to do it right then and there while it's top of mind would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you for those suggestions. And that's actually a great segue to the next steps. If you can go ahead, Ulu, to the next slide. So between now and mid-May, which is when we have to finalize the budget to get it ready for presentation approval to the congregation, clearly we'll be working on trying to increase the number of pledges that we have so that we can get closer to what we would like to accomplish. And as we get more information, we'll be refining this budget iteratively. We will have additional opportunities for people to provide input. We haven't talked about details, but we'll probably include something in next week's Liberal, send something out, a summary of this. I believe this meeting was being recorded so that it will be posted online so that people who couldn't be here or online can see it subsequently. If you think this was helpful, tell your friends so that they can get informed, because the whole idea is to try to help everybody understand this process and where we're at. So we'll be aiming for more pledges, we'll be refining these estimates, we'll be asking for more input. And just along those lines, I would say if you have pledged, thank you. Again, we're behind on acknowledging those pledges, so sorry about that systems glitch. But I just want you to know, speaking for myself, and I think for the board, and undoubtedly for the staff, thank you. Deep gratitude for the generosity that everybody in this church has shown time and time again. If you're one of those people who has a recurring pledge and you thought, I didn't really think about increasing it, please consider doing so, or at the very least, let us know your intent. We are assuming that those recurring pledges will continue. Again, we're hoping that they'll be increased, but we're at least assuming they'll continue. And if you're willing to, help reach out to people who haven't pledged. If you're somebody who has pledged, if this church is important to you, if you want to move us further up into the aspirational goals that we have for this church, and you're willing to share why that is with others. Some of you have already done it, a few of you have spoken from the pulpit, but one-on-one is so helpful. So if you're willing to make that reach out to somebody that may not have pledged or may not have increased or you think could, do so. Ask them. That one-on-one is so important. And again, if there's any other questions, I'll stick around for a little while. Feel free to email me. Whatever I can answer, I will. Whatever I don't have the answer to, I'll try to get it. I'm not trying to hide anything. I just don't know everything. So, but I will do my best to make it as clear and as possible. And with that, I will turn it over to Reverend Ashley.
Yes, I was just going to say. Thank you for leading us with your generous and non-anxious and very well-informed leadership. If you want to increase your pledge and you don't know how, this is how you do it. This is the fastest way to do it. You email our bookkeeper, Jai, J-I-E, J-I-E, jai@firstuniv.org. That's all. Or you can email me if that's easier, but jai is where it'll get done. All right, we're going to take a deep breath and shake out all of the intensity of this meeting. That was a lot. And you all are in record-breaking attendance at this budget meeting, so we should applaud you all too. We're going to take a moment to just bless each other. The budget does not exist outside of us. We are the budget. And the budget is a moral document. It tells the story of our commitments to each other and to the world. So let us breathe. Let us remember we live in a world of abundance. Scarcity is the lie. We have all that we need. We just need to share it. Let us make it so. Let us warm up our blessing hands. I love that this didn't exist like a year and a half ago, and now it's apparently something we do, and even our teenagers lead us in it. We can do this, beloveds. Let's just say it out loud together. We can do this, beloveds. And as we say during our time of meditation and prayer each week, you are not alone. We are holding it together. May it be so. May we make it so. Thank you. And if you want to join the call party, come see me right now, and we have sheets and scripts.
Thank you.